Good morning, or I guess afternoon now. So, Kevin was pretty great, so we'll try. I don't know how to follow up these keynotes this morning, but we'll get ourselves started. So this morning, this is clearly not a technical talk, but it's important to a wide array of developers and technologists all over the world. We're talking about open source licensing. My name is Jeff Strauss. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, which, like, if you look at the United States and like kind of put your finger right in the middle, I'm basically there. I own a company called Arana Software. I'm involved with an event called the Kansas City Developers Conference, and among other things, I am a lawyer. Sorry. But I don't practice law anymore, so it's okay. I say I'm a lawyer in recovery. I'm trying to push some of that aside. Now, importantly, while I am a lawyer, I'm not licensed in Europe, obviously. I'm licensed in the United States, specifically Missouri, where I'm from. But we're going to talk about open source licensing, and a lot of those issues transcend borders, transcend communities, transcend the industry. So when we talk about different kinds of open source licenses, we'll be talking about sort of contractual issues, rights and obligations, and how we use open source software with our tools. That stuff is relevant whether you're in Europe, the United States, or elsewhere. Now, importantly, I am not your lawyer. So I say that because, first of all, I don't want to be disbarred, even though I don't practice law anymore. Also, keep in mind that we're talking about general concepts here. Okay, we are talking about how you can learn more about how open source works, different types of licenses and principles. We're not talking specifically about your situation because every situation is different, right? This is more so you can think about things the right way and think about how you will work with your teams and with your legal counsel if that is relevant for you. Now, why does this matter? Why do we care about this? Why are you here? Right? This is a Java conference. There's tons of great technical content. You're here to talk about this. Why? Because it impacts everyone, right? I'm actually not from a Java background. I'm from a .NET background. I'm a JavaScript developer. But in the JavaScript community, or in the .NET community, I should say, for a long time, there's a lot of pushback, right? And a lot of big enterprise-type shops. Like Kevin said not to use the word enterprise as much anymore, but in enterprise large shops, there are a lot of companies that in the past would have a knee-jerk reaction, right? Open source, we don't do that. We can't use that. Well, that's impossible today, right? Certainly in the .NET community where I come from, that's impossible. But in the Java community, we still have things like Spring and Hibernate and tons of open source projects throughout the Java community that we all use in our projects, on our teams, day in and day out, no matter how large or how small. So these are things that we're used to checking the box and saying, yeah, I know it's open source, I have a license, I agree, but do we even know what we're agreeing to or what it means when we accept and bring an open source library into our projects? So we're going to start off with a couple of definitions. We're going to say, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. I want to make sure we're thinking about this the right way. For starters, what is open source? What does that even mean? I think we all in our head have an idea of open source software, but it's not necessarily a complete picture or a full picture of what it means to be open source software, right? Open source software is effectively just software that is licensed for use under an open source license. What does that mean? Well, to be an open source license, and we're going to talk about several very popular licenses a little later in the talk, but to be an open source license, it has to satisfy a certain set of criteria. Okay? We're talking about these each in turn: free, redistribution, source inclusion, derived works, non-interference, non-discrimination. What do these things mean? What does it mean when we say that we are that we have an open source license and open source software? First off, free redistribution. We have a saying in the United States. People talk about free speech, right? It's a very big deal, First Amendment stuff. It's part of our core part of our Constitution. And oftentimes when I talk about open source software, I mean it's free. People oftentimes interchange the term free software, open source software, or like the FOSS community, free and open source software. But when we say free, we mean free as in free speech, not free as in free beer, right? We mean free information. It means the free sharing of ideas. The reason, and where a lot of the open source community comes from, and the ideals behind it, are that there's a general idea that among the open source community, people like Richard Stallman, who were at the foundation of the free software movement, that if you have software executing in your environment, on your machine, You should have freedom to see all of the information, right? You should have freedom to understand how it works, see what's happening, and redistribute it as you see fit, because it's executing on your machine. So the idea here is that if you have software executing on your machine, you should see all of it. You should be able to redistribute it as you see fit. It may be free like free beer. It may. But as we'll talk about it, it's not necessarily. Source code. I think this is the most obvious that people know when you think about open source software. We're saying it's source code. The source code has to be readily available for viewing by a consumer, by a user. So if you incorporate open source software into your project, you have the right to see the code, right? You have the right to actually pull down, I don't even know what this does, but you have the right to pull down the source code. It doesn't always have to even be freely available, but it has to be readily available. And in the old days, I guess, it was even okay to not have it be freely available for no charge. There could be a nominal charge to acquire if it's a large library, as long as it's reasonable, as long as there's no barrier that prevents someone from being able to see the code. And importantly, it obviously can't be obfuscated. And that goes beyond just saying, obviously, the compiled binaries, but things like obfuscation. So in the JavaScript world, for example, there's all sorts of tools to uglify, to obfuscate your JavaScript that is still sort of readable, but there can be no process required by the user to have to try to decompile or unuglify, deobfuscate the code in order to see what's going on. It has to be clean, clear, original code. Now, Derived Works is an interesting one because it actually has a couple of subcomponents. For starters, it means that you have the right to modify the software. Not only can you take it in, use it, and freely redistribute it, right? You have the ability to make changes as you see fit. You can modify it, and moreover, after you've made modifications, you have the right to redistribute or to distribute your modified code, what we call a derived or a derivative work. Now, when we talk about licenses a bit, we're going to talk a little about copyleft licenses, things like GPL. If you're familiar with it, great. If you're not, you will be. What is a derivative work and what is distribution is an important consideration. Because a lot of times, licenses like the GPL have restrictions on what you can do with your derivative work, and can you, say, make it closed once you've incorporated something that is open. But you have to ask the question, what does it mean to actually distribute? Because not everything is distribution. Taking in source code and building a project and then using it, even if it's not only you, using it within your organization is not necessarily distribution. So a lot of the considerations of we're using open source, are we going to get into trouble when we start using this tool? Well, are you distributing it? This has become a major consideration with things like software as a service. Right? Let's say that you are developing something up in the cloud. Right? And you are creating some form of service. Say you have an API, you have some other call that other consumers are using, but they're making calls into your service, into your product, which is sitting on some server. It may be in a data center. It could be in a server room in your own business. It could be a server or a virtual server that you control somewhere in the cloud, but it's something under your control. And what happens is you spit out some sort of response. You haven't, under most of these licenses, you haven't distributed software. Because remember, it's about whatever's working on your computer, whatever's happening in your environment, you have the right to see. So the code that's happening up in the cloud, the code that's happening on the remote web server, isn't being distributed at all. Right? However, there's a couple of caveats. First of all, how often does that really happen in today's world? I mean, maybe you're only running a clear service, but it's possible that you have a lot of things happening up on a server somewhere, but you're still sending something down to a client. You're sending a mobile application down. You're rendering HTML, and you're sending JavaScript. You're still serving something up to an end user. It might be on a mobile device. It might be in browser. So there's still oftentimes code, say a JavaScript with a web application, that's still being distributed. So it's possible, even within a single application package or single overall project, it's possible that some of your code some of your application is being distributed and some is not. And that's something to think about when you decide whether you're concerned about the software you use and what you incorporate in your development process. This one has the slide after this I've never been really fond of because I can't quite figure out how to present the idea, but non-interference is kind of an interesting one. Non-interference effectively says, I use this because A lot of times, even though they're like even old icons, a lot of times the example is different operating systems, different execution environments. So an open source project cannot, like an open source license, cannot require you to only use this on software that works within a certain environment, on a certain OS. You can't say you can use this software and it's free for use under an open source license, but only if you are developing for something that will run on Linux or another open source operating system. Then that's not open source. It can't be you can use this software, but it can only be used if it's distributed digitally. You can't create physical media and ship. To the extent we ever ship anything on physical media anymore, you cannot ship it in physical media. You can't interfere with the technology stack, their execution environment, or the form of distribution. Okay. And lastly, non-discrimination. I was really happy. Yesterday we were walking around. We got in yesterday. My friend John and I got into town yesterday. We walked around for lunch around the harbor area, kind of near where our hotel is. And there were signs everywhere for Harry Potter, and they're playing like a live symphony kind of thing, I guess. And so I was like, oh, I have this slide. That's good, because then at least there's references to Harry Potter. So you cannot discriminate with use. And what that means is you cannot in any way dictate or confine the way the open source package is used by others. So for example, a less dramatic example, a big fintech company, a big financial technology company creates some library that is really useful in financial calculations or whatever they do, and they decide to take that component and make it an open source library, an open source tool set. And they say, anyone else is free to use this, so long as you're not using it on financial software because that competes with us. Not allowed. Right? You can't discriminate in use. And the reason I use Voldemort for this, right, the Harry Potter reference, is because the open source definition even says even for evil. You cannot even limit use for evil purposes. So, in a super geeky Harry Potter world, if Voldemort gets tired of his Death Eaters, and he says they're not getting the job done, and they're not finding all the Muggle-born wizards or whatever, I'm really a nerd, I'm sorry, and decides, all right, forget that. I'm going to write my own open source application that will just go out and I'll create drones that'll go and find and take care of the Muggle-borns for me. The terms of the license can't prevent that, even though it's an evil purpose. Now, interestingly, just because he does that doesn't mean he's not going to Azkaban. Right? So keep in mind that when we talk about intellectual property, we talk about licensing, we're talking about really about contracts. We're talking about rights and limitations and how we use property. It has nothing to do with, say, like criminal law. And again, I'm not a European attorney, but I'm pretty sure, committing genocide against Muggle-borns is probably against the law, wizarding law, whatever. And just because the open source license doesn't prevent you from doing something doesn't mean other laws don't apply. Right? So you got to keep that in mind. I said before about free software. Right? Free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. So you can sell open source. You can sell it and make tons of money. You can make tons of money on open source software. The problem with that, and the challenge is, so can everybody else. Right? So I can create something and I can sell open source software to all of you, and the next day you all can turn around and resell it. Without royalty to me, because I'm not allowed, under an open source license, I'm not allowed to demand royalty. So how does that work? Right? How do we do that? How do we make money off open source when everybody else can immediately compete? Everyone gets my code, everyone sees what's happening, they can try to make it better, and they can try to compete directly with me. Well, there has to be more going on than just the open source library or the open source software itself. So take, for example, I think they're actually, I want to make one other point before the next slide. When I talk about commercial software, a lot of people use these terms interchangeably, at least in the States. Commercial software, I think of as being software that you're paying for, right? As opposed to free as in free beer. Proprietary is closed source, as opposed to free as in free speech, free as in free information. So something can be commercial software, and it can still be open source and not be proprietary. So for example, I would say, so now I think they're a sponsor, I believe, but take someone like Red Hat. I think they are. Yeah? And Red Hat has enterprise Linux. The kernel's open source. Right? There's actually nothing that stops any of us from getting that software, right, the kernel of Linux, of Red Hat Linux, and selling it ourselves. However, they have a couple things going for them, right? They have brand and reputation. They have support. If you have under their enterprise Linux, you know that there are patches and there's security updates. There's all sorts of things going on with this that let you know that, yeah, okay, I could go download some other distribution of Linux, and that's great. But if I have this, I know there's something else that's sort of like makes me feel a little more comfortable using it, even though I could buy it or get it for free somewhere else. Another way this happens is with consulting services. So you have open source software, you put it out there, you sell it, someone else can sell your software, and that's fine. But you have special knowledge, right? You have the ability to maybe help people integrate your software with their systems. You can provide training depending on how deep and how complex of a product it is. You have the ability to provide something beyond simply the software that makes people still want to come to you. Because if someone goes and buys, if I sell you my software and then someone buys that from you and they come to me and say, hey, I bought this thing. I know I didn't buy it from you, but I need help with it. I may not offer those services. Right? So what it comes down to is you have to think about like OSS++. Right? How do you take, if you want to sell open source, how do you plus it? How do you say, you have to have a value add. You have to have some way to say, all right, I've got open source software, everyone else can use this, but I want to put it out there. I want to keep it open source. I want to put it out there and allow other people to have it, but I still want people coming to me to get it. I still want to make a living off it and sell it. Got some definitions. So we talked about what makes something open source and kind of what we can do with it. Now we're going to talk about a bunch of licenses. Or specifically, we're talking about 4 of them. There are a lot of open source licenses. The open source definition, I mentioned one a little bit before I said open source definition. The open source definition, if you're not familiar, is basically controlled and run by the Open Source Initiative. These guys have a really nice website with a lot of information on it, access to a bunch of valid, approved open source licenses, and they also maintain sort of not only this open source definition, some of the things we were just talking about, like what is it to be open source, but they have like a great FAQ to give a lot of questions and answers. So the quote about not even for evil, right? You can't discriminate even for evil comes from that FAQ. It's a lot of good information. Now, there are a lot of open source licenses. To be an open source license, not only do we have to satisfy those list of non-discrimination and non-interference and source code inclusion and all that, but a license actually gets reviewed and vetted by these guys. They're the ones who maintain and say, yes, this satisfies all the requirements to be considered a legitimate open source license. There are a lot of them. We're going to talk about 4, but those 4 and their variants make up something like over 80% of projects on GitHub. So it gives you a lot of coverage from just these main 4. And we're going to kind of go through in order from what we call permissive licenses through copyleft licenses. And a copyleft is things like the GPL, and we're going to talk about that towards the end of this section of the talk. Permissive licenses are basically everything that are not copyleft. Copyleft, which we'll go into more detail shortly, basically says you use this thing and you use it under an open source license, so it's an open source product or project. But if you do redistribute and use it in some way, your derivative works must be distributed under GPL or under whatever other, that same license. So under most copyleft licenses, and this is where businesses and teams get into trouble, is under a copyleft type license, you might be trying to use something that's open source, incorporating even a small piece into a much larger system that you're developing, and now under the terms of a copyleft license, it's possible that you cannot make your resulting product proprietary at all. You have to open source the whole thing. Permissive licenses are the licenses that are not that. And we're going to start at the most permissive and work our way through. First off, there's the MIT license. It really is MIT, like the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's where it comes from. The MIT license has been around a very long time, and it is the most permissive license. I'm fairly certain it is the most common license on GitHub. Everyone uses it, and most people who are not really deep into the GPL side of the community love the MIT license. Me as a lawyer, I like the MIT license. I wouldn't say that I love it, because when we talk about Apache, it does things that MIT doesn't really do for us. But the MIT license, look at this slide. Don't read this. Don't read that. But look at it in the sense that For a legal document, it's pretty short. Like, we lawyers are nothing if not lovers of words. Lots and lots of big words and lots of commas and semicolon separated lists of all sorts of stuff that nobody else can understand or read, right? This is a very short, simple document, and that's the MIT license. Now, there's only a couple things to really worry about here. The first paragraph is basically giving you a non-all-inclusive list of all the stuff you're allowed to do with the software that's licensed here. The second little short paragraph is about attribution. If you're going to take this open source software and then distribute this software somewhere else, you need to make sure you give attribution. Please include this license with the software when you redistribute it. And please give attribution appropriately. Don't remove somebody else's copyright notice. Don't remove the information about the people who created the software in the first place. And as a general rule, please don't do that anyway. Right? Don't take away don't take away attribution of somebody else's work. That's not an open source principle. That's an intellectual property principle. That's an infringement principle. Give attribution for the work that somebody else has done that you are using and benefiting from. If we go back one, the all caps is another weird thing about lawyers. When we really want you to see something, we shout at you. And I can't read that stuff. I find that actually a lot harder to read in all caps, but the point is they want to make sure you see it. Or maybe they want to make it harder to read, actually, and they pretend like they want you to see it. But what that whole last thing was a warranty, and it basically said everything's as is. There is no warranty. It's an express disclaimer of any warranty about the software. That's really all MIT has. It's that simple. You can use, distribute, modify, change, do whatever, sell, et cetera, with the software. Please retain attribution, and keep in mind this is as is. BSD is also from an academic institution. It's from Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. The BSD is the Berkeley Software Distribution, which is like an OS distribution from, I think, as far back as the late 70s or early 80s, maybe. The license itself is not that old, because actually the open source definition and the idea of open source software is a newer idea than the more general idea of like freeware or free software. And so as a license, none of these licenses are more than about 30 years old. But BSD, I think, may have even come into effect, if not around the same time as MIT, maybe even a little bit earlier. BSD has the same two core principles, but BSD has actually at least 3 different versions. The older ones were longer, and they've gotten progressively shorter. They have a bunch of different sort of names, but the simplest way to think of it is there's a 4-clause, and a 3-clause, and a 2-clause version. The 2-clause is basically equivalent to the MIT license. So if you see something that is BSD, but it only has 2 little numbered sections, one of those is about attribution, and the other one is about the disclaimer of warranty, the as is. It is actually the newest version of the license, the most recent. It's not necessarily the most commonly used. I'd say the 3-clause is probably the most commonly used. The 4-clause, the original one, had, well, this is actually only the 3-clause one. The 3-clause one has an idea of non-endorsement. This is in use frequently. You'll see it a lot. The non-endorsement provision says that if you're using our software under this license, you cannot, in your promotional materials, in your advertising, in your whatever else, you cannot use our, let's say I'm the author of the software, I have a brand, I have a logo, I have information, my name. You cannot use my name and likeness in a way that makes it appear as though I endorse your product, right? Or suggest that your product is good because it uses my software without my consent. You cannot basically act like, think something like Hibernate or like Spring or something in the Java world that's open source. You can't take that, use it, and say, well, you know our software is good because it uses this other thing that you trust as good. Or stuff written by this other author you trust as good. Here's the problem. First of all, that may be not true at all, right? That component may be good, but you may be horrible, right? Or your software may be full of bugs. Well, the problem here is, to the upstream author is now you've sullied that person's reputation. You made it look like this software, they have plastered everywhere, software built using X, Y, and Z, and this software is a mess. So now it makes X, Y, and Z look bad. That is a requirement of the 3-clause BSD license, which is fairly common. Now the 4-clause, which used to be ubiquitous but is not anymore, is this advertising provision. The advertising provision seems like a great idea at first, but it sort of takes the idea of attribution and goes way past anything that turns out to be reasonable. The advertising provision in the 4-clause BSD says when you put out your advertising materials, your promotional marketing materials for your product that you have created using this software, this open source software, you need to make sure that you give attribution to all of the authors who contributed to help make this software possible. That sounds nice. Open source packages live a long time and have lots of contributors, and those lists get very long, very quickly. And I don't know what a comparable periodical or magazine would be in the Java world, but like in the Microsoft world, in the .NET world, you look at something like the MSDN magazine. Buying a half or a full page ad in that magazine is not a cheap thing, and all of a sudden you had a situation where half the page was just listing people who contributed. It was a major problem. So it became onerous without a lot of value. The cost ended up outweighing the benefit. So they removed it, stripped it out of the BSD. You will still see the 4-clause BSD with this provision in the wild, so you have to look for it. And then decide whether you're willing to deal with that if you see it. There's a good chance you're not. Both of these licenses came out of the academic tradition. They both came from a place that was from a time when everybody was happy and building software was about research, academia. Nobody was really, it was too expensive for everyone to have computers. This is the day when the computers were giant things in a lab, and you went with punch cards, or you were developing in early compiled languages. And there wasn't a huge commercial place, and there wasn't a lot of issues with things like patents and stuff like that. So the MIT and the BSD license are licenses over copyright. Now, there's a whole other talk about intellectual property that kind of delves probably way too deeply for a non-United States crowd because it gets into United States law too much. But at its core level, think about copyright as the creation of a work. You authored something, like your code. A patent is about protecting an invention. Patents have very real value. The MIT and the BSD licenses do not license patent. They license copyright. You have the right to use, distribute, and share and incorporate this code, but not necessarily any patentable inventions or novel works that are within it. So then all of a sudden this starts happening where the trolls come out of the woodwork. Here in Europe, throughout the United States, and we live in a very litigious society in the United States, which I'm sure you're all aware, and patent litigation has become a huge thing. So there was no good answer for this in the MIT and BSD, so what happened is Apache came along, and Apache had an open source license before. There was like a version 1 and what they called a version 1.1 of the Apache license. And that license said that a lot of the same things that we see in MIT and BSD. It was more academic in nature. When the patent thing started happening, they threw it all out. Now, Apache 2 is not a simple language. It's not it's not simple language in the contract. Apache 2 is not a nice, easy thing that you can see on one screen on one slide. It's got a lot of definitions. It's got a lot of longer. It's got a lot of longer terms, and it's not as easy to read for a non-attorney. However, very importantly, it includes patents. The Apache license is what's really popular with people like me. Lawyers, big corporate counsel, we like Apache. Because, it's not to say don't use MIT, but we like Apache because we get a little more protection and assurance when it comes to having something that's patentable still be licensed to us, so we don't take in something and then find out someone tries to patent it, and it's like, well, we aren't allowed to use it anymore. So the Apache license grants you not only a license to use the copyrighted work, but it also allows you the opportunity to use the patented work, or the patentable work. But it comes with a catch. It has what we call a poison pill. Or a termination clause, termination provision, which says, and this, if you've been following all the stuff about React or Facebook over the past several months, this may sound vaguely familiar. It's not exactly the same. What the Apache license says is, okay, you get a license over the patentable work. However, if you institute patent litigation back against other authors and other contributors, and you try to effectively troll other contributors to this product, your patent license terminates. So we're all sharing, but don't take our goodwill and decide that now you're going to turn around and come back and sue everybody and make lots of money off something only because we license it to you. So if you institute patent litigation against other contributors, upstream or down, the Apache license goes away, or at least the patent portion of it does. If you are following the Facebook thing and the React thing, first of all, the good news is they've taken a step back and they've kind of ceded to public pressure. But with the React license, as a quick aside, is what they were doing was very similar. They had a license that said, we're issuing you all these licenses, all these things, but if you sue Facebook, not just for this thing that we patented, on something unrelated. If you institute patent litigation and try to make a claim against something else, if we actually infringe on some other intellectual property that you own and you try to sue us for it, we will take away your React license. So it wasn't limited to just a single set of things. It wasn't limited to like one library. It was, we're giving you license to use React. However, if something else comes up down the road, even if we Facebook, are the bad actors, we can take your license away. So it was different. People didn't like that. It's Apache. GPL is way different from all these others. GPL is a true copyleft license. I always say like free as in freedom. It's one of their many logos, and I kind of chuckle at it because I think, well, sort of. Sort of. I mean, free as in you can argue it's the most free because it's a copyleft license, which again, remember we said earlier, means that if you use this GPL library and you mix it in with this other stuff, other libraries or your own code, and create some derived work from it, and then you redistribute that, you can do that. That's great. It has to be GPL. Right? That's not true with these other licenses. Right? You can take something that's under MIT and you can mix it in with your code and you can distribute it and you can make it totally proprietary and closed source. Your derivative work can be closed source. That's not true with a copyleft. So on the one hand, like, yeah, it's the most open and it's the most free, but it's also the most restrictive. It's the most problematic in the maybe in the corporate world. It is the hardest to use. There's a bunch of different versions of GPL. So I said we were only going to talk about 4 different licenses. And that's true, except I already took BSD and turned it into 3 licenses because there's the 2 clause, the 3 clause, the 4 clause. GPL, there's a bunch. Right? GPL, there are at least these 4 that you need to know about. Unlike things like Apache. Apache had an old version 1.1, and what we talked about was before all the patent license stuff, but you don't really see it anymore. If you see Apache, it's going to be the Apache 2 license. With GPL, that's not true at all. So there are a lot of open source projects still using version 2 of the GPL license. Version 2 of the GPL license didn't have all the patent stuff. Didn't have some other more modern things that have come into the open source lexicon, the open source community, and importantly, as a result, had a lot of, I don't know, sort of compatibility issues with other software. And so GPL 3 was largely created to address that problem. It was largely created to address the compatibility issues and bring the patent stuff in, but you will still see GPL 2 out there. LGPL, which I'm fairly certain is the lesser general public license, although I've also seen many times people say that it's the library general public license. I think that's wrong, but I've never definitively been convinced because it's used so much that at some point it's like, well, maybe it does mean that because everyone says it anyway. The LGPL is actually a little easier. It's like almost a copyleft. It is a copyleft, but it's a weak copyleft. It gives you some wiggle room. It says that if you take this library and you incorporate it into your project, but only through like dynamic linking, you're not actually modifying the source code of this GPL library. You're not statically linking or intrinsically combining it with your own code. You're just using it, making a reference. That's okay. You still, on your distribution, you still have to distribute the GPL3 code or the LGPL code, and you still have to make that available under the license, but all of the other portions of the derived work that you've created, you don't have to worry about. It's not copyleft with respect to that. But if you start mixing the code more tightly, you could have a problem. The AGPL actually goes the other direction, and it's probably the most extreme of all the licenses. And it's, for me, a very hard license to justify use, unless I'm really working on something that's strictly supposed to be in the open source world forever. Because the A stands for Affero, I don't really know why, but the AGPL, which is the Affero General Public License, is a license that says that it closed a loophole. So if you remember a little while ago, we talked about what is distribution. What does it mean to distribute? And if you're just executing code up here on a server somewhere, but you're just sending responses back and you're not actually distributing anything out to an end user and end client, then maybe you're not distributing software. The AGPL closes that loophole purposefully. That's its reason for existence. It says even if you have a service that is entirely executing in a remote environment that is not being put on someone else's machine, it's still GPL, and you still have to make that service open source, and you still have to make the source code available and distribute under AGPL. So that's a pretty tough pill to swallow for me. We'll talk about GPL a little while longer because there's a lot of concerns. It's not that people can't use GPL in an enterprise or corporate environment, but you see it's harder. Right? Like you see how it's more difficult to use because if you're trying to build proprietary software and you're worried about having to take your entire, you spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars or more on some huge product and you put it out there, you don't want someone to come back one day and sue you or say, you're supposed to give us all the source code. Right? So there's a lot of concern. Compatibility is another area that we have to think about when we think about whether we can use GPL. And when you hear people talk about GPL compatibility, we're trying to answer this question. Can code under license whatever be combined and redistributed with code covered by the GPL? The answer to that, lawyers say this all the time, it depends. The answer to that is it depends. And it depends on what the other license is, right? The question we're asking is this other license GPL compatible? Is license X compatible with GPL? And the reason we have to consider that is because the GPL says not only must you distribute your derivative work under a GPL license and have it be open sourced, but you can't combine it with other stuff that necessarily places other restrictions on the end user. So if I combine software with some other licensing terms, just because I've combined it doesn't mean those licensing terms go away. And if the terms of license X add additional restrictions or limitations on the user of my software, I don't even have the choice. I can't even use them together in the same project. Or I would necessarily be violating the GPL license. So a couple of examples of that are Apache with the old version, the GPL version 2, because GPL v2, remember, didn't have all the patent stuff, didn't have the patent license. Apache 2 adds the patent license. Well, adding more rights is great. GPL doesn't care. GPL compatibility doesn't ask the question, are you letting the user do more? You're letting the user have a license over the patentable works. That's fine. But on the other hand, Apache also says if you do this other thing, then your license terminates. Now you've placed a restriction on the user that does not exist under GPL, which means if you take a GPL v2 library and try to build something with it and find something else that's under the Apache license, you cannot use them together in the same project without violating GPL. By the same token, the old version, the 4-clause version of the BSD, which has that crazy advertising requirement, can't work with any GPL because no GPL license requires that. But the other thing that's really important to remember is that even if it is compatible, let's say we have something that's a 3-clause BSD, and we have the GPL version 3, and we have the Apache, and we want to combine all those things, and those are all compatible with each other. Just because they're compatible and I'm allowed to use them, the end result still has to go out under GPL. It doesn't go out under Apache or under BSD or whatever else. It still has to, that's the crux of the copyleft idea. So what we're asking with GPL compatibility is, am I even allowed to do that? Can I even mix these 3 things together? Okay, so what? What do we do with all of this? What do we do with this information? How do we now use it? Because now if we've decided we are going to either create open source, use open source, both of those things, we have certain things we have to consider. First of all, what about contributions? If we take something and we decide we are going to have open source software ourselves as an organization, we are going to share some of our code into the open source community. Do we accept contributions? Or if we bring something in and we see something we think we can make it better, we bring an open source library in and we and our own team decides to make improvements, do we want to make contributions back? Right? Do we want to submit a pull request? Do we want to make it better? Or do we just want to keep it to ourselves? There's no obligation to make contributions. There's no requirement that we do that. And there's no requirement that we allow contributions from others. Right? Other people are allowed to take our open source software and make modifications. We don't have to suck them back into our project. They can fork it and do whatever they want. But if we're going to have contributions, we have to consider CLAs and CAAs. CLA is the more commonly seen term. Right? CLA is a contribution license agreement, which most larger open source repositories will require you to have if you're going to submit a pull request back in, or if you're going to accept them, you're probably going to have something like a CLA, which basically says, yeah, we'll take your contribution, but you're licensing your work back to us, like you're giving us a license necessarily by making the contribution. You're licensing your authorship and your rights and everything else. Okay? That's not necessarily too troubling. But if you see a CAA, it's not the same thing. A contribution assignment agreement, right? Assignment basically means transfer. So a contribution assignment agreement says we are actually transferring, if we're submitting these contributions back to the project, and you own it. It's yours. Right? Now we have the license, right? We may take it back under an Apache license, MIT license, whatever, but we've actually transferred ownership of our work. We've actually given it back to the project. If you're in a big organization, you need to think about that and be aware of whether that's going to be acceptable or not if you decide to make contributions. Surprise. This slide actually surprises me every time I see it, because I was like, oh, right. A lot of people have asked over time, is there a concern about surprise liability? If we use open source and then we put it out into the ether, is someone to come back after us if something goes wrong? Someone's using software, could be 3, 4 links down the chain. Do we have a concern? Well, the good news is, probably the good news, is no. No. I mean, it's as is. Right? The open source software is as is. Almost all the open source licenses we've talked about, and most, if not all of the others, say this is as is software. We've just claimed warranty. You use it. Do it. If it's broken, feel free to fix it. But don't come back knocking on our door sending us letters from your attorneys. That's great if you're the author. It can be a concern if you're the consumer. So always keep that in mind, because there's no warranty on the work. You got to think about the GPL risk in the first place. This is mostly a question of how are we distributing, what are we doing, right? Are we even distributing software in the first place? Because I keep going back to this example of what does distribution mean? But if we are doing something where for the most part we aren't distributing software, if what we're doing is executing something on a server, running an API, whatever, internal product, something I didn't mention earlier, an internal product, so something that we develop on our team but never leaves the walls of our company, and there could be 300 people or 3,000 other people who are using this product, but it's strictly internal. Which means not only not people outside the organization, but not even contractors, right? Employees of the company use this tool and receive this tool. I haven't distributed anything, right? So if that's the case, you don't have to worry about the GPL risk, because the requirement to open source your software, the requirement that you have to say, okay, well, I created derivative work and now I've distributed it, well, that arises when you redistribute your derivative work. So you may not have a lot of GPL risk. It just depends. What if there's no license? What if you just found something on Stack Overflow or on a blog? It's like, I don't know, it's just out there. I need to solve this problem. My boss told me to solve the problem today, but it really had to be solved 2 weeks ago. I just found out about it. I'm under a lot of pressure. Here's this snippet of code. There's no license on there at all. There's nothing about it. Great, I can just use that. No, 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 you can't. No, you can't. Because somebody created something, and if there's not some form of license somewhere, just because they didn't tell you you can't use it, doesn't mean that you can, because it's still copyrighted. The reason we have licenses is because when somebody creates something, they're the copyright holder. They're the author. Unless they allow you through some sort of transfer, assignment, work for hire situation. Do you have work for hire in Europe with employers? Maybe so, where you create software in the course of your employment. It belongs to the employer, not to you. And that's just some sort of scenario like that. The author is still the owner. And without a license to use it, you can't use it. You're technically infringing on their rights. So no license is not the best license. No license is bad. It's bad. Consideration if you're going to use open source software is think about how do I take care of security? If it's Red Hat Enterprise Linux, I'm not worried. Well, maybe I don't, right? I don't think I'm worried. And there's support if something goes wrong. If it's, I I don't know an analogy in the Java space, I'm sorry, but like in the .NET world, there's a library I use a lot as an example. There's something called AutoMapper that's kind of a nice like left to right copy tool for things like your classes and data objects and things. And it's written by this guy, Jimmy Bogart. He's a friend of mine, a couple of others, and he's a great guy, and he does a great job. But it's his. It may have 1 million downloads a month or a year or whatever, but like he's the dude in Austin, Texas who wrote this thing. So if something goes wrong, how good is the support? You need to know what you're using when you're using open source software. Is this from some large enterprise that decided to open source something? Or is this some dude in his basement in his spare time moonlighting that created something really awesome, but that doesn't mean you're going to get great support? Or for that matter, what happens if it dies? Because what happens if Jimmy just gets bored? Now, full disclosure, I use AutoMapper on a lot of projects, right? But what if he just decides he doesn't have time for that anymore? He's the lead architect at a big consulting firm, and what if he doesn't have time for it? Who's going to take up the reins? Is there some sort of chain of command? Do you have confidence that this thing you're using is still going to be taken and controlled? Because you're building software that you want to survive for a long period of time, and you don't have to rip something out because like a component you used stopped getting support altogether. We only have a few minutes, but I'm going to tell a quick story because this is important. What is your long-term strategy? I had a client, actually prior to, the screen just turned orange. Now I really, but we got like 4 minutes. So I had a client who was a startup that built a photo several years ago, a photo sharing kind of cloud-based app. It was a really cool thing. We were brought in just to do sort of like a WPF, like a Windows-based uploader type thing that would sync with his cloud-based services. It was fine, and all of a sudden one day Shutterfly came along, and Shutterfly wanted to buy him for many millions of dollars. This guy was a serial entrepreneur. He's made many millions of dollars already anyway. But the problem was, and it worked out okay because we thought about these things, and were able to give the answers. But the first thing that happened with his counsel, his lawyers, and the lawyers for Shutterfly was they called people like us as his vendor, as his developer arm, right? And they said, "What have you got in there?" So you got to think about what your long-term strategy is. Is this something that will always be internal? Is someone going to try to acquire it? Are you going to sell it down the road and distribute it even though you're not now? You've got to always be thinking ahead because the way you weigh the costs and the benefits and the risks of using a given type of open source software depends upon not only what you're doing today, but what you're going to do 6 months and 12 months and 2 years down the road. So you got to keep that in mind. All that being said, I'm not telling you not to use this stuff. Right? Sometimes I can sound like an alarmist, but I'm not actually at all, because using open source software, it does save us time and money. We're not reinventing the wheel. Right? That's great. That's a wonderful thing. Open source does a lot for us, but the problem is we have to think about teamwork and how do we make that happen? How do you get everybody on board? And how do you keep track to make sure we don't do the wrong thing? Because the last thing you want is to find out that some new developer, even an experienced developer, decided that they needed to like click a button and move on. So they clicked the checkbox, accepted something without ever looking because they don't really want to be troubled with that. And now 6 months later, you find out you have a major problem because you've incorporated some GPL library into your software, and now it's too late to do anything about it. Right? So there are tools out there. Like Black Duck software is really well known. There's a bunch of tools that audit your software. I won't support one over another, but there are tools out there that can help you audit your software and see what's in there. They can be alarmist. My concern with things like those tools is that sometimes they will go out of their way through their blogs and through their notifications that you need to be concerned. And sometimes you don't. So a simple thing for a smaller project or a smaller team that I advocate is use like a thumbs up and thumbs down. Create a simple list. Know enough that you can say, hey, we've decided as an organization that MIT and BSD is fine as long as there's not 4 clauses. Apache 2 is great. We've decided that for this project and this one, LGPL is fine, but all the other GPL licenses are not. Have some sort of list. And if it's not on that list, we don't know. We need to ask the question. But you need to give people the opportunity. Right? You need to give people the tools and the communication. I keep going back to the keynote right before me, but it was something Kevlin talked about was communication. Communication among teams. Sharing knowledge. Right? How we're trying to actually share knowledge to make good software. Well, you have to allow people to do that. You have to make sure everyone on your team has buy-in, understands the risks, understands what they can and can't do, and if they're under a deadline, they need to solve something, and they at least know enough to check and say, was that thing a GPL? Then they look, and they say, okay, maybe I'm part of the team, and so I'm going to take the time to see what the second hit in Google was. Maybe I can at least look there and see if there's something that works better for our team. That can save you 80% of the time. just to give people the tools and the communication so that they all know why this matters, so your team knows why it matters, and what they can do about it. So the takeaways, what I want everyone to kind of think about is just have a plan, right? Which is to say, whatever, and that plan is different for everybody, but know what it is that you're going to do as a team, right? Invest in that. Include your team in the decision-making process and invest in that process. Take the time to solve the problem now, right? Take a deep breath and have a way that you're going to handle open source considerations in your organization. And make sure everyone's on board. Make sure everybody gets to have a say. Make sure everyone has a stake in the process and gets to talk about what works or what doesn't to the extent that you can. And if you do that, you can stop worrying about the kind of minutia. We go out and do what we really want to be doing every day, which is like making awesome software and just solving problems, and stop worrying about it as something going to come back and bite us down the road. Again, my name is Jeff Strauss. This is my email address. That is the largest I've ever seen my face on a screen, and that is just horrifying. If you want to continue the discussion at all, feel free to reach out to me at Jeffrey Strauss, Jeffrey R-E-Y, 2 syllables, not 3. And use the hashtag OSSImpact, and it'll make sure I see it and I can answer questions. I'll also be around at least through mid to late day tomorrow. Thank you all very much.